The year pythons began appearing in Ogidi was unlike any other. It started gradually, one python found coiled around a broken fence, another slithering across the empty market stalls at dawn. But soon, they were everywhere. They appeared in doorways, curled silently under trees, or stretched lifelessly along the paths. The villagers spoke of them in fearful whispers, glancing over their shoulders as they went about their days. Children were kept close, and the elders began muttering of curses, old debts, and sins that had come back to haunt them. Kiki watched the scene unfold each day with a hollow feeling in her chest. She had long avoided the village square, but now it was unavoidable. Every morning, new pythons lay curled in the center of the market, their thick bodies ominously silent. No one dared touch them, and a heavy tension blanketed the village, pressing in on Kiki from every direction. Her mother, Masoma, was troubled by his silence. She believed that Kiki's solemn behavior was grief for her friend Faustina, who had been found dead by the river path just weeks before. Faustina's death had shocked the village. No one knew what had caused her to slip and fall, striking her head. But Kiki knew. She alone knew what had happened that day, the jealousy that had overtaken her, and the shame that now bound her in silence. Masoma's eyes held sadness as she watched her daughter. "You mustn't close yourself off. Kiki, don't be too hard on yourself," she said one night, her voice low and comforting. "Faustina is gone. Yes, but life goes on." Kiki said nothing, nodding stiffly. But her mother's words only deepened her guilt. She remembered the last day she had seen Faustina alive, the resentment that had churned within her at the sight of Faustina and Romanus laughing together. Romanus was the new boy from the city whom all the girls talked about because he was so tall and handsome. She and Romanus became lovers one day after he helped her carry her water pot to her head. Kiki knew that what she saw the day she walked in on Romanus and Faustina was nothing. Yet she couldn't control the sudden surge of jealousy that enveloped her that day. Even though she was all smiles that day, her heart was on fire. She knew Romanus was a very handsome boy, but she knew Faustina, her friend since childhood, wouldn't try to snatch Romanus from her, yet she couldn't help but feel jealous. "Look how they are laughing together," Kiki said to herself. It didn't help that they stopped laughing when she joined them under the jacaranda tree. On the day Faustina died, Kiki and Faustina had coincidentally met on the lonely dirt path that led to the market. The path was lonely because halfway on the path lived a widow whom was believed to have killed her husband and her 5 sons. Those who had had the misfortune of seeing her said she was old, with a face gnarly like the bark of a tree. It was believed that she cursed the path so that all that used it were inflicted with one form of sickness or misfortune. Of course, no one could prove if indeed the path was cursed or not. But somehow it was Kiki's and Faustina's favorite path to the market because it was shorter than the ones everyone used. So on this day, Kiki and Faustina were ambling down the path, giggling and talking girl stuff when something rushed towards them from the nearby bushes. It was a hyena. They had never seen one that big. Had they stopped and stood their ground, the hyena would have turned away or continued its journey to wherever it was supposed to. But fear so stupefied Kiki and Faustina that all they could think was to IUN.S, so they made the costly mistake of showing the hyena their backs. Kiki and Faustina took off. Some distance later, Kiki, who was the faster of the 2 girls, decided to turn to see what was happening, since she had stopped hearing any noises. She turned. Behold, Faustina was lying on the ground, must have slipped and landed with her face on a rock. Her face was bleeding. She wasn't dead, but she was motionless. The hyena was nowhere in sight. Kiki could have carried her friend home or at least go get help, but just as she stood over Faustina, she was taken by an inexplicable jealousy that she remembered the incident with Romanus and decided to abandon Masoma to her fate. She took one long glance at Faustina's motionless body before walking away. Kiki had somehow convinced herself that Faustina would wake up. But now she was gone, and the pythons lay across Ogidi as if they knew the truth. The villagers, too, felt the strain of this unexplained phenomenon. They looked to the elders for answers, and the elders, in turn, decided to consult Isemu, Ogidi's most prominent seer, who, it was said, could see and hear from the gods. They hoped he could interpret the gods' intentions, fearing that the python's arrival was no mere coincidence. "The gods are angry," Masoma muttered one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, "and they do not send signs without reason." Kiki's throat tightened as she listened. She could not bear to imagine what would happen if anyone found out the truth of Faustina's death. Oh, the dread in Ogidi grew thicker with each passing day. People began to avoid leaving their homes after sunset, whispering of the gods' displeasure. And yet, each morning brought more pythons, either lying motionless along the paths or curling in strange places as if they were keeping watch over the village. The elders gathered at dawn and decided to summon Isemu to perform a ritual, hoping to learn why the gods had sent such a curse upon them. Word spread quickly, and by evening, nearly the entire village had assembled in the square, their faces tight with fear and anticipation. Children clung to their mothers. Men exchanged worried glances, and a heavy silence settled as they waited for Isemu to arrive. Kiki stood near the back, gripping her mother's hand tightly. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of the secret that weighed on her. Beside her, Masoma watched Isemu intently, her lips moving in a silent prayer. When Isemu finally arrived, he walked slowly to the center of the square, his dark robes brushing the ground, his face shadowed under his hood. He raised his hands, and the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "The pythons are messengers," Isemu declared, his voice strong yet foreboding. "The gods have sent them as a warning. They are here to remind us of a broken promise, a betrayal that must be revealed." A murmur spread through the villagers, their fear intensifying as they looked around, wondering who could be responsible. Kiki felt her stomach drop, and she looked down, hoping no one noticed her trembling. Isemu's gaze swept over the crowd, as though he could sense each hidden sin, each dark thought. His eyes landed briefly on Kiki, and she felt a chill run through her. She squeezed her mother's hand, trying to steady herself, but the weight of her guilt pressed harder. "The gods will not lift this curse until we answer for our wrongs," Isemu continued. "We must call upon the spirit of the lost one. Only she can reveal the truth." A gasp rose from the crowd. Summoning the spirit of someone who had passed was dangerous, an act only undertaken in times of desperate need. But with the pythons overtaking the village, they all felt the urgency. Kiki's breath caught. She had hoped her secret would die with Faustina, but now, with Isemu preparing to summon Faustina's spirit, the truth threatened to come to light. Oh. As the villagers dispersed to prepare for the ritual, Kiki felt the world close in around her. She moved through the crowd, her mother's hand on her shoulder, feeling as though every eye was on her, as though they somehow knew. Her legs felt heavy, each step pulling her deeper into a pit she couldn't escape. That night, Kiki lay wide awake on her mat, staring into the darkness. Her mind swirled with memories of Faustina, her laughter, the kindness in her eyes, the way she trusted Kiki without question. And now Faustina's spirit would be summoned to speak the truth. Kiki could already hear the words, the accusations that would reveal her betrayal. By the time dawn crept through the window, Kiki felt hollow. She hadn't slept, hadn't moved, barely breathed. Her mind raced, and a desperate thought formed. She could escape, leave Ogidi before the spirit revealed everything. She would spare her mother the disgrace, spare herself the shame. The villagers would believe she was guilty for fleeing, but at least her mother wouldn't have to witness her hanging. When Masoma entered the room, Kiki sat up, her face pale and worn. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something I need to tell you." Masoma's brow furrowed, her eyes softening as she sat beside her daughter. "What is it, child?" Kiki took a deep breath, her confession tumbling out in a whisper. She told her mother everything, about Michael, about her jealousy, about how she'd left Faustina alone on the path. Masoma's face fell as the truth sunk in, and her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with shock and sorrow. "Oh, Kiki," she whispered, her voice breaking. But despite the hurt in her eyes, she pulled her daughter close, holding her tightly as Kiki began to sob. "We must leave, Mama," Kiki whispered. "If they know, if the spirit tells them, they'll kill me. And I can't. I can't bear for you to see that." Masoma sat in silence for a moment, her face pained but determined. She nodded slowly. "Yes, we'll leave tonight. The village mustn't know." As darkness settled over Ogidi, Kiki and Masoma moved quietly through the shadows, taking only what they needed. They slipped through the empty paths, making their way toward the village's edge where a dense thicket hid the road to the neighboring village. But as they neared the border, a torchlight flared, and they froze, their hearts pounding. A guard stepped forward, blocking their path. "Where are you headed at this hour?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Masoma stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We're going to my brother's wedding in the next village. It's important family business." The guard narrowed his eyes, suspicion flaring. He looked at Kiki, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "And why would you travel by night if it's family business?" Kiki opened her mouth, but no words came. She saw the guard's expression harden, and before she could react, 2 more guards appeared, surrounding them. Without another word, they seized Kiki and her mother, pulling them back toward the village. By morning, word of their attempted escape had spread through Ogidi like wildfire. The villagers were convinced, their suspicions confirmed. To them, there was no doubt that Kiki and her mother were guilty, and the tension that had simmered for days now boiled over into anger and cries for justice. Ooh. The morning sun cast long shadows over Ogidi, but its warmth did little to ease the cold anger of the villagers. Word of Kiki and Masoma's attempted escape had spread to every corner, and people gathered outside the small prison where they were being held, their faces set with suspicion and fury. Inside the cell, Kiki clung to her mother, her heart racing as she heard the murmurs and shouts from the crowd. She could barely make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, betrayal, and a growing thirst for justice. She buried her face in Masoma's shoulder, feeling as though her heart might break from fear and shame. "Stay close to me," Masoma whispered, stroking her daughter's hair with a trembling hand. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." But as the hours dragged on, the crowd outside only grew louder. Villagers called for blood, their voices mingling with curses and demands for retribution. It wasn't long before the village youths, led by their spokesperson, began banging on the wooden doors of the prison, shouting for Kiki and her mother to be handed over. "Let them pay for the curse they brought upon us," a voice rang out, sending a chill through the air. Kiki felt her mother's arms tighten around her as the door shook, the wood creaking under the pressure. She could hear the desperation in the villagers' voices, their need to blame someone for the pythons, for Faustina's death, for the darkness that had settled over Ogidi. The pounding on the door grew louder, and Kiki could feel panic rising in her chest. Her breathing came fast, and she clutched her mother's hand, feeling as if she were on the edge of a cliff, about to be pushed over. Just as the door seemed ready to give way, a commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Stop!" It was the king, his voice booming over the crowd. He stepped forward, his presence instantly restoring order as the villagers fell silent. "We will wait for Isemu's guidance," he declared, his tone firm but calm. "The gods will reveal the truth, and only then will we act." The youths hesitated, casting glances at each other, but reluctantly stepped back. The tension in the air remained, thick and unyielding, but the king's authority held, and the crowd gradually dispersed, though they lingered nearby, eyes fixed on the prison as if waiting for the moment justice could finally be served. Inside, Kiki exhaled shakily, feeling the reprieve wash over her like cool water. But she knew this was temporary. The villagers' anger had only been postponed, and the thought of facing Faustina's spirit still filled her with dread. The king sent guards to keep watch over the prison, and the hours passed in a tense silence as the villagers gathered again in the square, preparing for the final ritual. The air was thick with anticipation, and Kiki's heart grew heavy as she realized that her fate was now beyond her control. When the sun dipped low in the sky, casting the square in shadow, Isemu arrived, his face grim. He moved with slow, deliberate steps toward the center, and the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for the gods to speak through him and reveal the truth they sought. "Bring them forth," Isemu commanded, and the gods led Kiki and Masoma from the prison, guiding them to the center of the square. They were surrounded on all sides by villagers, their faces set with judgment, as if the truth had already been decided. Isemu raised his hands, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Today, we call upon the spirit of Faustina to reveal what has been hidden," he declared. "We ask for truth and justice." A murmur ran through the crowd as Asemu began the invocation, his voice low and rhythmic, summoning Faustina's spirit from the beyond. Kiki's body felt numb as she clutched her mother's hand, her heart pounding with fear and resignation. She knew what was coming, and she braced herself for the inevitable. The villagers held their breath as Asemu's voice rose, calling on Faustina's spirit to speak. The air around the square grew thick and cold, as if a shadow had settled over them all. A chill ran through the crowd, and mothers drew their children close, their eyes wide with fear and anticipation. In the center of the square, one of the village elders, Faustina's distant relative, stiffened, his body trembling as a strange energy seemed to overtake him. His eyes rolled back and his mouth opened, but it was Faustina's voice that filled the air, hollow and tinged with sorrow. "Who calls me from beyond?" the voice asked, sending a ripple of gasps through the crowd. Asemu stepped forward, his tone respectful but firm. "Faustina, spirit of the lost, we seek the truth. Tell us why the gods are angry. Tell us who has wronged you." For a moment, there was silence, then a hollow laugh echoed from the elder's lips, carrying a bitterness that made the villagers shudder. "You think you know the truth," Faustina's voice replied. "You know only the surface of what lies beneath." Kiki's heart raced as the spirit's words pierced the quiet. She felt as if the entire village was watching her, every eye filled with accusation. She could feel her mother's hand on her arm, trembling with the same fear and dread that filled her own heart. The spirit continued, her tone growing colder. "I was betrayed," she said, "by one I trusted, one who was blinded by jealousy, one who abandoned me in my hour of need." The crowd turned as one toward Kiki, their eyes filled with judgment and fury. Whispers filled the square, confirming their suspicions, reinforcing what they already believed. Kiki felt her knees weaken as she looked down, unable to meet their eyes, her guilt laid bare before them all. "Kiki," the spirit's voice called, making her flinch as if struck. "You valued your pride and envy over our bond, all for the sake of a boy you had only just met." Tears slipped down Kiki's face as she felt the weight of Faustina's words, her worst fears realized. The villagers murmured, some shaking their heads in anger, others calling for swift justice. Masoma clung to her, her face a mask of horror and helplessness as she braced herself to shield her daughter from the crowd's fury. But then, just as the villagers prepared to move forward, the spirit's voice changed, her tone shifting as if recalling a forgotten pain. "There is another," Faustina's voice whispered, softer now, a tremor of anger rising. "The one who sought more than just my life, the one who desired the lands that should have been mine." A stunned silence fell over the square as Faustina's voice rose, strong and clear. "My uncle," she said, the name carrying the weight of her accusation. "The man who finished me off, who killed my father and plotted to take everything from my family." A collective gasp escaped the villagers. All eyes turned toward Faustina's uncle, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He staggered forward, as if pulled by an unseen force, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The elder's body shook as Faustina's spirit continued, her voice filled with bitterness. "You killed my father to seize his land, to make it yours when I had no one left. And when you found me, you thought to do the same, to finish me off so no heir remained." The uncle dropped to his knees, his body racked with sobs as he began to confess, his voice choked with guilt and desperation. "It's true, it's all true," he cried. "I killed her father. I wanted the land, the wealth, all of it. I saw Faustina there, helpless, and I struck her down." The crowd recoiled, stunned by the revelation, unable to process the truth they had been blind to for so long. Villagers looked between Kiki and the uncle, confusion and shame filling their faces as they realized their mistake. As the uncle's cries echoed across the square, his body convulsed, and with a final, broken gasp, he collapsed, lifeless, at the feet of the villagers. The villagers stood frozen, the weight of Faustina's spirit's revelation settling heavily upon them. The square was steeped in silence, broken only by the low whispers of those who struggled to grasp the truth. They had been so certain of Kiki and her mother's guilt, blinded by their own anger and fears. Now, the real betrayer lay dead before them, his life taken by the force of his own sins. Kiki clutched her mother's hand, her heart racing as she realized the full impact of what had just happened. The judgment that had loomed over them, the punishment that had seemed inevitable, was suddenly lifted. But even in the relief of her innocence being proven, she felt the sorrow of her betrayal toward Faustina, a sorrow she knew would stay with her forever. Masoma's grip on Kiki's hand tightened, her gaze shifting from the villagers to the path leading out of the square. It was as though a silent understanding passed between them. This was their only chance to leave. Before anyone had time to regroup, or to turn their anger on them for any lingering sense of betrayal, they could disappear into the night and leave Ogidi behind. As murmurs began to rise once more among the crowd, Kiki and her mother quietly stepped backward, inching toward the shadows beyond the square. The villagers were too consumed by the shock of the uncle's death, by the guilt of their own misjudgment, to notice the two figures slipping away. Kiki and Masoma moved as silently as they could, blending with the growing darkness as they made their way out of Ogidi. Once clear of the village, they broke into a run, their footsteps swift and soundless on the forest path. Neither of them spoke, each step carrying them farther from the home they had known, the life they had shared. But in that quiet flight, Kiki felt a weight begin to lift. The past could not be erased, and the sorrow for Faustina would remain, yet she sensed a chance to begin anew. As dawn broke over the trees, Kiki and her mother crossed the final stretch of land, leaving Ogidi and its haunting shadows behind. In the light of a new day, they walked forward, free at last from the judgment of others and ready to face whatever lay ahead. Please subscribe, like, and share. Also comment what you feel about the story.